Hello. Um, in today's interview, Amy Kind is with us. Welcome, Amy.
Nice to meet
Um,
you.
so I will say a few words about your work for our listeners first, and then we will talk about the philosophy of imagination. All right. So Amy Kind is the Russell K. Pitzer Professor of Philosophy at Claremont McKenna College. She is currently the director of the Gould Center for Humanistic Studies. She has previously served as the chair of the Department of Philosophy from 2009 to 2012, and associate dean of the faculty from 2005 to 2008. Her research interests lie broadly in the philosophy of mind, though most of her published work has concerned issues relating either to the imagination or to phenomenal consciousness. She has edited 4 books: Knowledge Through Imagination, co-edited with Peter Kung; the Routledge Handbook of Philosophy of Imagination, Philosophy of Mind in the 20th and 21st centuries, and just this month, right? Just this month, one came out, Epistemic Uses of Imagination, co-edited with Christopher Badura. She has also written 2 textbooks, Persons and Personal Identity from Polity Press, and Philosophy of Mind, The Basics from Routledge. And actually, we met 2 years ago, almost 2 years ago, right? It was October 2019. We had a conference at Bilkent, exploring the mind's eye. It was about imagination. It was an interdisciplinary conference, neuroscience, psychology, and philosophy. And Amy was there. You gave a talk, and then we went to Cappadocia. Right? We had a Cappadocia trip, and then now we are based on that conference. Actually, we started editing a special issue for the journal Synthèse, and it is almost over, actually. So yeah. All right, one more time, thank you very much for joining me today, and welcome, Amy.
Thanks. I'm sorry we're not doing this in Turkey, but happy to do it this way.
Yeah. I hope in the future we will be, have the opportunity to physically actually meet again. All right, so about imagination. What is imagination, first of all? Right, so
you want to just start off right in it. Okay. I think it helps in thinking about what imagination is to just get some examples before us, maybe, so we're sure we're all talking about the same thing. And so one activity, say, where it's very common to think of imagination playing a role is with respect to childhood pretense, right? So we're pretending things as children. We're hopping from sofa to sofa, and there are crocodiles in the water, or hot lava that we don't want to step in, right? Or we're pretending to be astronauts going to the moon. So when we're doing all of that, we're imagining things about the environment around us. We're imagining things about ourselves as we're engaged in those pretend games. So that's one place where imagination commonly plays a role in pretending. Now, as an adult, we're probably not jumping from sofa to sofa. I mean, I don't know, but I haven't jumped from sofa to sofa in a while. But of course, many adults engage in acting, and that's another place, like maybe the adult form of pretend, where imagination plays a role. Another place where I think we often engage our imaginations is when we're reading literature, fiction, or we're seeing a movie, or we're seeing a play. So we're not doing the acting ourselves, but we're still imagining things about the people that we see on stage or the characters that we encounter in the book we're reading. And so that's another place where I think we engage in imagination. Finally, one more example of this sort. There are often times that we're in endless Zoom meetings, or we're in in-person meetings, and we start maybe fantasizing about a particular vacation that we might want to take if the world ever allows, or just other kinds of things. We start imagining various situations in order to escape the doldrums of our everyday reality. So those are some examples of imagination, and notice that they all are sort of escapist in a sense. That there are ways in which we escape from our present reality, either by pretending or engaging with the literature, or by fantasizing, right, and escaping the boredom that we're in. So imagination tends to get associated with the kind of fantastical that way. But I want before we go on, I want to say that there are a lot of contexts, I think, where we also use imagination, and it's perfectly natural for us to think about it, that are not fantastical. So if you are trying to redecorate your apartment or your house, and you go to the store, and you're trying, this is a standard example that philosophers use, you're thinking about buying a sofa. You might imagine how the sofa looks in your living room, right? And you can't, I mean, it's a lot easier to do it by way of imagination first before you lug the sofa home and figure out there, right? You don't want to make this purchase if it's not going to work out for you. So in the furniture store, you use your imagination. But I also think we use our imagination in that way. So again, not a fantastical way, but in a very sort of reality focused way. When we're trying to make decisions about the future, we're trying to plan for the future. So you're trying, so now, I mean, I mentioned fantasizing about a future vacation, but now suppose you're actually planning that vacation, right? And you're trying to decide whether to go to, I don't know, I'm trying to decide whether to go to Hawaii or Bermuda or something, or I'm trying to decide whether to go to the desert or to the mountains or to the beach, right? So 3 very different kinds of places. And I might imagine myself, on the beach or in the mountains or in the desert to try to figure out what I would most enjoy. And so I use my imagination in that very practical way to help me figure out which vacation to book. And likewise, when we're trying to figure out what career to take, or what course to take, or what major to pursue, what college to go to, all of those kinds of things, I think we use imagination. So we have sort of these more fantastical uses, and then we have these more world-driven uses there, where they're really teaching us about the world. And so we want to sort of bring them together. But notice that, so I think it helps if we notice in both ways of using imagination, what we're really doing is we're engaging in some sort of representations that take us beyond the here and now, or outside of the here and now, right? And so it might be that we're the sort of objects of our imaginings are completely fantastical, like pink elephants or wizards, right? So in that way, we go beyond the here and now. But it also might be sort of driven by me, but me in the future, right? Or me in another location, or the sofa in another location. And so again, it's a way of thinking sort of beyond or outside of just the here and now. That's a start. That's a very minimal start. Let me just say one more thing before we move on, which is that unlike some other mental activities where it seems like the purpose of the activity is to aim at the truth, imagination doesn't require us to aim at the truth. And that's one reason that it's so useful in these fantastical contexts. So we're not doing anything wrong if we imagine, like, it's kind of weird, right? Like, you're being irrational in a certain sense if you believe there's a pink elephant out of sight to the left, right? But it's not at all weird if you imagine that there's a pink element off to the left, out of sight. And so imagining, unlike, say, believing, imagining allows us to aim away from the truth, right? We're not doing anything wrong if we aim away from the truth. Now, that's not to say that we can't, in imagining, try to get things right. We can, but we don't have to do that. Whereas with belief, you're being sort of irrational if you're not aiming at the true, right? Like if you were to say, oh, my goal is to form false beliefs, right? Beliefs that aren't true, that we'd be like, why, right? Like, there's something weird going on. Where if you say, like, oh, I like to imagine false things every day, be like, oh, fun. What false things are you imagining today? So that's a start for us.
Yeah. All right. So then there is a representation involved.
Yep.
Right? In all instances of imagination, there is a kind of representation involved, and that representation can be the representation of the real world or close to real world, but like the closer possible worlds we can say are represented, or maybe farther away, right?
Yep.
Like magical, fantastical kind of stuff too. This sounded like maybe imagination is like drawing a picture, and you can draw a more realistic picture of maybe a map, right? Even map is a representation, and you can use the map in order to infer something about the real world, right? Where should I go? Something like that. And this sounds like when you say when we plan, for example, for a future vacation. How would I feel if I went to this place or this place? Now I'm imagining, right? I'm trying to imagine, and then I infer from that imagination something. Or it can be just fantastical, as you can say, as you just said. Okay, what is do you think the nature of this representation? Can you say more about the representation that is involved in imagination?
Yeah, so I like the map analogy, actually. That's really great. And the way you started in terms of imagining picturing something, that is, I think, a very common way to think about it. So you might say that loosely, we might say something like, well, perception puts us in contact with the actual world, and imagination puts us in contact with the possible worlds. And so there's that kind of analogy. And so we can think of imagination as being a sort of giving us a sort of quasi-perceptual access to the possible worlds. So my own view of imagination treats it very imagistically, like oddly, despite well, I don't know what the root of the word would be in Turkish, but in English, at least, there's this tight connection between imagination and image, right? And so it seems like imagery would be sort of built into imagination. Actually, is it like that in Turkish? I'm just curious.
In Turkish, there is one word. It's, I think, the root is either Arabic or Persian. I'm not sure. So I don't know if that is. There is another word that we use in more scientific contexts, imgelem, and that does, it is very much like imagination. The image is the root for that one.
Gotcha. Okay. So in any case, it does seem like there's a connection between imagination and imagery. Now, I think it's important in doing this, because we were already using the word mental picture. We want to make sure that we don't confine it to the visual, because we can imagine in other sensory modalities as well. So actually, there aren't pink elephants out of sight, but my dogs are out of sight, and one of them was just crying a little. I don't know if you could hear her. She wants me to pay attention to her. But in any case, if I were away and I wanted to imagine my dogs, one way I could do it is by imagining their cute little faces. But another way I could do it is by imagining their barks as they greeted me, right? Or I could imagine the way their soft fur as I pet them. So we can imagine across all sensory modalities. So in English, at least, and I don't know if this works in Turkish, but we can extend the notion of image so that we can talk about auditory images or tactile images and gustatory images as well. And so we can broaden it out. So when we're talking about imagery, we're not confined at all to the visual domain. And likewise, I actually like to stretch it even further so that we can talk about, say, pain imagery or emotional imagery. I mean, if imagery sounds weird there, we can talk a little bit about like sensory presentation or something. But there's this sort of sensory-oriented representation that has a certain phenomenal character. Like it feels like something to imagine your dog, and it feels, when I imagine my dog's face, it feels sort of like seeing them, but not exactly like seeing them. Most people think that there's a sense more of the presence of the dog when you're perceiving them as opposed to when you're imagining them. So some people say there's like there's a sense of absence when we imagine. But regardless, the point is that on my own conception of imagination, it's a sort of imagistic way. And even when we're doing these sort of extended activities that involve planning and so on, we're calling upon mental images to do so.
And those images, yeah, as you said, so there are, it's not just visual, it can be different. I can just imagine my favorite dish, for example, how it tastes,
Sure.
that
Yeah.
kind of thing. But you say it is all sensory. So it doesn't have to be five senses. It can be pain or something like that, or maybe an emotion, right? So how
Yeah.
I can maybe imagine that. All right. So, and then,
Actually, can I just say one quick thing? We also, I mean, with respect to the emotional imagery, one way that becomes important, and I didn't use this as an example when I was talking about imagination earlier, but I think we imagine things about one another all the time. So, I might see a certain expression on your face and imagine how you're feeling, right? And we often talk about that in terms of empathy, but that's another place in which imagination plays an important role. And that's those kinds of images that are involved would be more like experiential images or emotional images, right? So I see you when you look a certain way, and I imagine how you're feeling, and it's sort of sorrow or pain or confusion, and I'm sort of imagining that. So anyway, just wanted to note that the extension of like the representation sort of goes further.
Yeah. All right. And so then if sometimes people call different kind of mental, activities as imagination, even though they do not, for example, involve imagery in the sense that you are talking about. So for example, supposing something. So imagine, I say, imagine you are very rich. What would you do with your money? Well, you don't have to really visualize that, right? Just suppose, just assume that you are rich, then what we will do? Or entertaining a proposition, you are just thinking about it. So, but you don't have to use any kind of image. You don't need to form an imagery. So then, those are not imaginations, right? Instances of imagination for your account, or can they be?
Yeah, it sort of depends. I mean, we have to figure out exactly what's going on in all of them, and it might be there's a different answer in each particular case. So first of all, let's just talk about supposing for a second. I think of supposing as a very sort of minimalist activity. I think of imagination as much more robust. So one place where we do a lot of supposing is just when we're arguing. So, I mean, in philosophy, it would be sort of in a formal context, but I mean, you could hear it on the news, and the talking heads, they might say, oh, well, suppose this policy were enacted, then this and this and this and this, right?
Yeah.
Or we do it again in the course of a class on logic. We say, suppose such and such, and then we figure out the logical structure of what follows. And that activity, I don't think, in most instances, I don't think that we're engaging our imagistic capacities, and I don't think we're imagining. And I think we do it really quickly, really easily. We can suppose almost anything at all. And there's like no difficulty, and we don't really have to do anything. All the words have to do is sort of run across our mind. Now, that said, someone might ask you to suppose something, and you might go beyond what they asked you to do. That is, you might start imagining it, right? So if I say, suppose such and such a policy were enacted, you might start imagining in a more rich way what that's like. And so even though the instruction that you were given was to use the word suppose, that doesn't mean that's only what you did. You might have imagined as well. Okay, so I think of supposition as a much more deflated kind of mental activity. But now I think you were giving me gently an objection to my account of imagination, because you said we can imagine in a rich way, like not just supposing. We can imagine being rich or other things like that. And sometimes people use examples where maybe you might think there couldn't be imagery. So imagining you're rich, I mean, the first thing that comes to my mind when I do that is I imagine myself sort of sitting on a king in a fairy tale, sitting on my piles of money, my throne with the gold coins all around me. So I don't know, maybe I'm just an imagistic person, but like that one, I sort of immediately imagining I was rich was, I was suffused with imagery. Now, do you have to do that? Well, maybe not, but I suspect that if you're really engaging with the proposition, you might have different images than I do. They might not be as rich, they might not be as developed, but I suspect there's some images there. Now, sometimes people give examples where they want to say that it's hard to even see what images we would have. So one example that I think the philosopher Neil Van Leeuwen gives, I can't remember exactly how he gives it, but he talks about imagining that elves are immortal, right? Or imagining the immortal elves. And you might think, well, how do you get that into an image, right? Because immortality isn't really something that we can picture. But I guess I don't think that every element of the imagining has to be sort of like read off the image that you're using in order for it to be an act of imagining or for the image to be involved. So the fact, I mean, if I'm imagining, this particular elf being immortal, or even all elves being immortal, I think I am seeing the elves, I mean, that is mentally seeing them, and imagining of them, that is postulating, this property of them. Maybe they're all different things I can be doing, but I don't have to sort of like see the immortality for me to be imagining it and for images to still be involved. I don't know. Another silly example is people sometimes say like, oh, I got this question once, like, oh, don't we imagine world peace, right? Like we imagine achieving world peace, and we're not just supposing it, but we're imagining it. And what kind of imagery could you use? Again, I think it's kind of like almost a failure of imagination to say that there couldn't be images involved in this, or that there aren't images involved in it. And the images, again, I think differ quite a bit from person to person. But I mean, when you imagine world peace, you might imagine, children encircling the globe, holding hands, or you might, you just might imagine like daisies and doves and people in tie-dye, whatever it is that you're imagining. I mean, it doesn't have to be any one of these things, but I think if you're really imagining it, right? Like as soon as you start to really do that, I think some images are involved. Otherwise, you're not really doing what you've been asked to do. So that's how I try to handle those objections.
So for example, when I was teaching, what was I teaching? Political philosophy, I think, in the Indiana University, and one day I did. So we were talking about the state of nature from Hobbes, Locke, anarchists, and Rousseau. So then I gave an assignment to students in the class. So they had their papers, and then in groups they drew about the state of nature, right? So for each group, I said, without other groups hearing, so you are doing Hobbes, you are doing Rousseau, you are doing Locke. So, and then there was a document camera, and then we talked about those things together. However, of course, different groups, some groups, 2 or 3 groups, they were drawing the same thing, but very differently. But there was always, of course, an image, right, that to represent it. However, different images, but they are the same thing. And some of them, even though a group is drawing Hobbes and the other is Locke, very similar. But one of them represents Hobbes, the other represents. So then I think this is similar to your point, right? So there is always a representation, an imagistic representation when we are when we are engaging in imagination, but we do not need to, or it might not be possible to individuate, right? The kind of imagination, just looking at the representation, like the example I gave in the classroom, students, drawing.
Exactly. I love that example. What a creative assignment that you gave your students. They must have had fun with it. But yeah, even if one group drew something very similar to the other group, still the one group was imagining Hobbes and the other group was imagining something else, right? And that's fine. So when I say imagination has to involve imagery, I don't think there's like a one-to-one correspondence between like, oh, well, this image always has to be in the service of this particular image always has to be in the service of this particular imagining, and this particular imagining always has to recruit this particular image. I don't think of it that way. There has to be some image involved, some imagery involved, but it could be a different one from person to person or from time to time. And that same image might be used to imagine different kinds of things at different times. Like I might sometimes use that image to imagine the Hobbesian state of nature, and sometimes use that image to imagine a different state of nature.
Do you think there is a limit to this? So, for example, can I use any image in order to imagine anything? So, or are there constraints about this?
That's a good question, and it's tricky, right? And this gets into the question to some extent of how our imaginings get to be about what they're about, right? So,
Yeah.
so sometimes we're introduced to someone, so we're introduced to two people. Say I'm introduced to Bob and Bill, and then later I forget which one is which, and so when I imagine Bill, I use an image of Bob, right?
Yeah.
Because I've gotten confused. Now you might ask, so what did I say? I said I'm imagining Bill, but I used an image of Bob. Okay, I have to remember which way I put it. And so you might ask, well, like, is that really an imagining of Bill or of Bob, right? Because it looks like Bob, but what I was aiming to imagine was Bill. Or, we might say like, oh, can I imagine a dog by producing something that is imagistically a cat? And I guess I'm inclined, so let me start with that second case. I guess I'm inclined to say that something goes awry there. It doesn't quite seem like I've done what I've set out to do. And I think likewise, something goes awry with the Bill Bob imagining. But what we can say is that, we might say something like, I'm imagining who I take to be Bill, something like that. And it's not like I'm imagining some Bill Bob hybrid. It's just, I'm confused about who Bill is. So I'm trying to imagine Bill, but I've sort of messed up. I don't know. I guess we could ask similar questions about pictures, and they're probably hard questions there, right? Like, so I mean, in art, right? An artist could draw a picture of a cat and title it "My Dog," right? And then we'd have all these interesting conversations about, what it's really an image of. What it's really, what that art is doing. And likewise with the portraits. So some of these questions about how our representations get to be about what they're about, it's interesting. I was actually, this very question is one of the things that got me interested in imagination like a zillion years ago, but I've never really solved it. So I don't have a great answer for you.
Yeah, I agree. This is one of the most difficult, because in the, for example, debate on whether about modal epistemology and can imagination help us figure out what is metaphysically possible or metaphysically necessary and that kind of stuff. And then, for example, Chalmers gives an example about physicalism. So if you can imagine that your mind exists without your brain, then, if that means that it is metaphysically possible that your mind can exist without your brain, then then physicalism is false, right? But he says, how though? How can we? So the philosophical zombie debate is another thing. But one thing he considers is you go to a doctor and then a neurologist, and then the neurologist shows you a X-ray, and then you look at the X-ray, and then the doctor says, look, this is your head, and it's empty. So now, is this imagining your mind existing without your brain? Right? Does it count? I don't know. Do you have an intuition about this? Because according to him, this doesn't count as, imagining that.
Yeah, well, I guess I mean, in that particular case, it's going to be very important in order to draw certain conclusions, certain philosophical conclusions. We might require there to be more of more content of the imagining than just that, because we're trying to draw certain conclusions about the possible. But I think in some looser sense, in a different kind of context, where we're not really trying to draw that kind of conclusion from our imagining one way or another, I think it could perfectly well count. I mean, here's another example. Like, does it count as imagining the sofa if you don't get the dimensions exactly right? Well, yes, it certainly does. But then sometimes it really matters that you get the dimensions right, because you have a very tight space in your living room, right? And so it's really important that you imagine things correctly. But that doesn't mean that when you imagine the couch oversized or undersized, whichever way you go, maybe by accident, right? Like you weren't trying to do that, but that's just what happened and you're imagining. That doesn't mean that you like failed to imagine the couch. It's just the imagining wasn't well suited for the purposes that you wanted to put it. And so I guess I think in the modal epistemology case, in the case where we're trying to draw conclusions about possibility from our imaginings, we might have a particularly high standard for spelling out the content of our imagining. So maybe it's going to be really important that there be some that what we're imagining involves a certain kind of experiential element and more detail.
Yeah. All right. So it is one question, what your mental image represents, right? There's one question. And what can you do with that representation? Or what can you infer from that is another question. And sometimes we have higher standards. If you really want to infer something, serious, substantial, then we will have a higher standards. Just one thing though might be a worry here, because yes, when we have for example, a painting of something, a painting of a cat representing a dog. Okay, why not? We are not inferring anything from that. We are not using it. We don't have high standards about that. All right. But imagination, as you mentioned, according to many philosophers, it is very similar to perception in certain ways. But now, if I look at a dog and I see a cat, yes, I'm looking at the dog, but am I seeing a dog? Because I'm seeing a cat. And I say, there is a cat there. And that's what I see.
Yeah, I mean, there's something tricky going on there because we might think that you're subject to some kind of illusion or you're hallucinating or something like that. It's tricky to know whether we can even call that perception. But I mean, we misperceive all the time. I mean, we misperceive colors, right? If the lighting is bad, we misperceive shapes if we're far away. And so there are going to be all kinds of misperceptions. But I guess what I would want to go back to in sort of fending off this kind of worry, I think I would want to go back to the point I made much earlier, which is that in imagining, we don't have to aim at what's true. And so since imagining can depart from what's true, it is different from perception in that respect. So perception is stimulus dependent. That is the world, like a change, if the world changes, your perception changes. But in imagination, we don't have that stimulus dependence. Like the world could change without our imagining change. So even though there's an analogy between imagination and perception, it's not that tight in this regard. One of the ways in which they come apart is with respect to stimulus dependence and stimulus independence.
Yeah. There's a causal connection kind of in perception, right? So because there's a dog, I see a dog, or however I see it, right?
Right.
Because of that. But even if modal epistemology, let's say imagination is a guide for, possibility, metaphysical possibility, I don't think we can say that because of that possible world, right, I can imagine. It doesn't close my imagination, right?
Exactly, right. So there'd have to be some kind of disanalogy. And I guess what I want to say about the modal epistemology case is that, or one of the things I want to say is that I don't want us to backwards infer from what we want to say about possibility to constrain what we want to say about imagination, right? Like, so let's figure out sort of what counts as imagining what.
Okay.
And then if that means that imagination is a good guide to possibility, great. If it means that imagination isn't, or isn't, is a less infallible guide to possibility, okay, well, then we have to figure out, something else to do. But it's kind of like wanting imagination to be a guide to possibility doesn't make imagination something or not, right? So we should figure out what imagination is and then see if it can be used in this service or how it can be used in this service. And so it might only be that like a very, I think Chalmers, you were talking about Chalmers before. I mean, Chalmers talks about, a certain kind of ideal imaginer, right? And so it might only be that a certain kind of ideal imagination in his sense can lead us to conclusions about what's possible. And we shouldn't use that to constrain our account of imagination more broadly.
All right. Yeah, and one other, I think, very important difference between perception and imagination is imagination is, in a certain sense, much more substantial sense. It is voluntary, right? You can actually choose what to see in your mind's eye, but you cannot choose what to see. You can choose where to look at, right? And under what conditions, but you cannot choose what to see when you are perceiving something.
Exactly. So, I mean, there are things we can do that voluntarily do that affect our perceptions. So we can close our eyes, we can put in earplugs,
Yeah.
right? And as you said, we can turn our gaze in one direction or another direction. But it seems like imagining, yeah, exactly as you said, is much more voluntary. So it's under our voluntary control. Now, not always. So it might be that that certain images pop into your head, certain imaginings pop into your head without you doing anything. So there might be some spontaneous imaginings that you don't feel that you can guide, but we do still have a certain kind of control over our imaginings that we don't have in the perceptual case. We can typically stop our imaginings, we can alter them, and usually we're in control of them to start and to stop. So imagination seems to be will dependent in a way that perception isn't. Yeah, that's another good disanalogy for us to think.
All right. So we did a little bit talk about the model epistemology part of things, but you also mentioned that well, we can learn something about this world, right? The empirical world, the actual world, from imagination. And you gave some examples for that, like thinking about the sofa, will it fit, or things like that, or how will this shirt look on me? And I'm just imagining it, and I'm just using this as I am trying to decide about the actual world, right? So then,
yes, exactly.
Yeah. So it's not just model.
Right. And so if you go back to some of the examples I was giving earlier at the start, I talked about some fantastical cases, and then I talked about some sort of more world-directed cases. And so I think imagination has a really big role to play in shaping our decision-making and our planning. And I think it can teach us about, the actual world in which we live, teach us contingent facts about the actual world in which we live. So I think I can know in the furniture store, on the basis of imagining whether the sofa, if I'm good at it, I can know that the sofa fits, right? Or that the sofa doesn't fit in my living room. That's just a fact about the world. I can, I think I can. So suppose you send a present to a friend or to a family member, and you can, I think if you're a good imaginer, you can know what their reaction is as they're opening it, right? That it makes them happy. And it's by way of your imagination that you get that. Likewise, I think you can know that you're well suited to this career or not well suited to that career. So going back to the word that you used earlier about a map, I think we can use imagination to draw ourselves maps, maps about the future. And then here's, I mentioned this earlier, but I mean, one place where we definitely use imagination to learn about the actual world is in our interpersonal interactions. So we imagine things all the time about our engagement with other people. And we're learning things about them and their reactions and about how we should respond in virtue of the imaginings that we're doing. I mean, of course, many times we're not doing those imaginings and we're just carrying on and not thinking about the people that we're conversing with. But often, I think we are, engaging in that kind of imagining. So certainly, I think for those of us like you and me who are teachers, right, we are often staring into a sea of faces and trying to imagine, what's going on behind all those puzzled looks, right? Or finally, we get some looks of a different sort, and we're like, understanding, right? And that's by imagining like what's going on behind those facial expressions. So imagination, I think, is really important for us for knowledge. But now we do have it's tricky because we just said that, like just before we were talking about this, we were talking about the voluntary nature of imagining. And some people have really worried that because imagining is voluntary, we won't really be able to learn from it. So why do we think we can learn from perception? Well, because the world sort of, constrains what we're seeing, right? Like if the world changes, what we're seeing changes and so on. But if imagining is voluntary, and we can just choose at will, like, I can just choose to imagine a pink elephant, right? Well, there aren't pink elephants. So how can imagination teach us about the world? So that's a really tough problem, but I think it's solvable. And I think one thing that's important to recognize is that, well, first of all, we have different aims in imagining. And so sometimes we're aiming at one kind of thing and sometimes we're aiming at another. And we can choose our aim and we can tailor our imagining accordingly. And I think when we're trying to learn about the world, one thing that we do as imaginers is constrain our imaginations in certain respects. And we try to constrain them to the world in the relevant respects. And the more successful we are at doing that, the more we can learn from our imaginings.
Yeah, and you give an analogy with computer simulations, right? We can use computer simulations to infer something about the empirical reality, the real life. But also you can use computer simulations for as games, right? So you don't aim, you just aim for, your aim is fun, right? Having fun by, engaging in that kind of computer simulation. Or you can actually simulate in computer some real life situation, and then you can infer something from that. And when you use the computer simulation in order to infer some information about real life and what would happen if something happened, that kind of counterfactual maybe kind of thinking, then of course you have constraints. Now it has to be realistic. It should be grounded on reality, even though it is a simulation.
Right, exactly, yeah. So if we're running a computer simulation, I mean, say we're going to send a ship, a rocket into space, right? And so we might, as kids, be playing some kind of, or not necessarily as kids, but we might be playing some kind of, rocket ship game on the computer. And then it doesn't really matter that the angle of the ship isn't like perfect to the angle that it would need, the trajectory that it would need to take off. But if we're actually trying to launch this rocket and we're simulating, how much fuel we need, and I don't know what one does. I was just listening to the new book by the author who wrote The Martian. So his new book is called Project Hail Mary, and I just finished listening to that. It's a great book. But so that's why I have rocket ships and that those kinds of simulations on my brain, because it takes place in outer space. But in any case, it really mattered to I won't give anything away about the book, but it really matters to the characters there that when they're running these kind of projections and simulations, that they get things right, because they're going to die otherwise, if they miscalculate the angles. And so likewise, in imagination, it's not usually a matter of life and death. I mean, it could be, right? Here's an example. Like, suppose this kind of example, I think Timothy Williamson talks about jumping across rivers. But in any case, if you're, you get lost hiking in the woods and you're trying to make your way back, and you can't figure out a way back, and then you come to this river and you need to get across it. Well, you're imagining about whether the far bank is close enough for you to jump, right? Like, that really matters, that you get things right. And so there, you're going to have to imagine very carefully to try to figure it out. But usually our imaginings, even our imaginings that are world directed and that are instructive and that we're relying on, they're probably not going to be life and death, but they could be.
Yeah. All right. And so you talk about this, the science fiction book, right? So Martian and the other one. What was the other one called?
The newest one is called Project Hail Mary.
Project Hail Mary. So in your papers, as far as I can see, you are interested in, science fiction in general, literature in general.
Yeah.
So what do you think? Is there a relation between imagination? So because normally when we read something, we visualize, or is that part of it? So what is the relation between, do you think, imagination and fiction and literature or art in general?
Yeah. So I think imagination plays a role in many ways in literature. So first of all, there is a creative element, right? So let's first go back to the author, and I think there is use of imagination on the part of the author to create, right? So sometimes the imagination is creating the characters, creating the world of the work of fiction. But then on the part of the reader, I don't think we're necessarily like purely passive information gatherers when we're reading fiction. I think that when we get engrossed in a work of fiction, we are imagining what's going on. And I mean, one example I like to use to show this is, say you have a book that you loved, and that you've read, and then they make that book into a movie. Well, many of us have had the experience when they see the movie of being really angry at the way that the character looks, right? Or a certain character, like, oh, what do you say? You say, that's not at all how I imagined that character being, right? And so while you were reading the book, you did have some kind of, in imagination, you had a sense of what that character looked like, and the filmmakers had a different sense, and got it wrong in your view. Or sometimes they get it right and you say, oh, that's exactly, that's perfect casting. That's exactly what I imagined that character to look like. So I think we use our imagination all the time when we're engaging with literature. And I think we use imagination in all kinds of creative endeavors. So I haven't thought as much about art per se, or music, but there are lots of people who do think about art and music. More generally, I guess I would say that I think imagination and creativity naturally go hand in hand, but they don't, I don't think of those two words as synonymous. So I think that we can engage in imaginative activities that are not necessarily creative. So for example, I might just do the same imagining every night. I mean, sometimes people do this. I'm not myself a meditator, but people often use images and imagination in their guided meditations. And so they might use this, every night to calm themselves down, or in their daily meditation, they might go through some sort of imaginative exercise. And as they repeat that, that's not necessarily a creative act, you might think, but many acts of imagination are creative. On the other hand, depending on how we're interpreting creativity, I think lots of acts of creativity, that is where we produce something genuinely novel, I think those are acts that involve imagination. But, some people happen upon an invention or a discovery by accident, maybe. And, we might say that there was this very creative solution achieved, but it was really just a matter of luck, right? Or it was, they were aiming to do something else and they screwed up and they got to this very novel result. Like it was a fortunate error. So I guess I would think that there can be acts of imagination that don't involve creativity, and acts of creativity that don't involve imagination, but nonetheless, the two tend to go together. And certainly when we're engaged in these fantastical kinds of imaginings, I think we're being creative all the time. I think kids are enormously creative when they're pretending. I think we as adults often stop pretending, but we still engage with literature. And I think we're exercising our imagination, and we can do so creatively as we're doing so. I actually think reading fiction is one of the things that hones our imagination. It makes us better at imagination. So.
Okay. So, for example, as you said, so as a non-creative example of imagination, in cognitive behavioral therapy, and also the Stoic philosophers talk about this kind of premeditatio malorum. You just imagine things, bad things happening to you, and then you just kind of prepare yourself, right? You won't be shocked when it happens.
Yep.
But you imagine the same thing. So as an exercise, for example, a couple of nights a week, you imagine something that actually you are scared of, but then you imagine that, and then you see that it is okay, it can happen, and then you can, endure that. So something like that. But the point is imagining the same thing, actually.
Yeah.
So yeah, so that, and these kind of techniques are used in cognitive behavioral therapy about trauma, for example.
Absolutely.
PTSD, that kind of things. All right. And one thing, actually, I am thinking now when you were talking about this more creative kind of using imagination. But so, for example, I was thinking, if I play chess, which I am not good at, if I play chess, then I imagine. If I like this move, then my opponent makes this move, then this, just imagining. Okay, I am novice though. But as far as I know, experts don't do this, right? In chess, they kind of see, you see the maybe because you talked about maybe some people can be creative without using imagination, and you said it can be just coincidence, that kind of a thing. But maybe non-imagistically creating because they are experts, is that something possible?
Yeah, you know, the chess example is interesting. Just to stay on that for 1 second. I don't know if the show The Queen's Gambit hit Turkey.
Yeah, I watched it actually. Yeah.
You watched it? Okay,
Yeah.
well, so think about the character there. She imagines
On the ceiling, right?
On a ceiling, right? And so, and when she wasn't able to imagine that the chess pieces moving around on the ceiling, right? Like that's when things started falling apart for her. So that's, I mean, that's, you know, it's a fictionalization, you know, I know, like you can only draw so much from it, but notice that that depiction of this very expert chess player, right, was like on the ceiling, seeing the chess pieces moving around. So anyway, I recommend that that series to anyone, both with respect to, I just think it was great, but also it does have this very interesting use of imagination with respect to chess. Now, some of the experts, so I guess you were saying they just like see what move to take. They don't have to go by way of
it's maybe one can say that it's more like perception than imagination for an expert.
Well, yeah, or maybe, I mean, it's actually, it's a really interesting question what the experts do, and how exactly they manage to do it, and they do it, I think, differently from how many of us expect in various ways. But yeah, if we could get a case, if there are cases like that, we might have a very creative move that didn't involve imagination, it involved something else. And here's another example. This one's maybe controversial, but I don't, I mean, because it depends on what you think about computers, but you might think that a computer could come up with a very creative proposal or solution. But I don't know if we want to talk about in a, you know, other than in a metaphorical way, I don't know if we want to talk about the computer having imagined that solution. So if you think that computers can give us creative outcomes, now I'm talking about the actual world, not the world of science fiction, because but the computers can come up with creative solutions, but maybe they're doing that without imagining. So
do we say that, or would we say in that case that the computer is being creative? So would we attribute that to them? So not imagination, I agree, because imagination is something conscious, right? So if we don't think that, especially according to your account, it involves some phenomenal consciousness, so because of the image. So then we wouldn't apply that to the computer, but would we actually say that the computer is being creative there? Do you think?
Well, I guess I'm inclined to think that we might very well. I mean, there are computers, you know, it's kind of fascinating, actually. There are computers that create art. There are computers that create music. There are computers that write poetry, I mean, maybe bad poetry. Now, of course, to get to that point, they're given this great stock of, you know, past compositions, right? And they've been taught a lot about music, but they're not just piecing together like, oh, this little snippet from this piece and this little snippet from that piece. That's not how they create. It's not just like addition. And then when you think about us, right, as humans, well, of course, creative composers have heard a lot of music. They also, you know, have this great stock of stuff to draw on. So the fact that we have to give the computer the knowledge base in order for it to come up with this composition can't count against its being a creative output, because that's what we do as well. You know, so either we're not creative, or we have to be prepared to grant that the computer is creative as well. Now, you know, are we fully there yet? Do we fully have computers with these creative outputs? I'm not sure, but I think we're pretty darn close. And if we're not already there, and I guess I'm not at all hesitant to say that they're creative. I mean, you know, I guess you could have a definition of creativity where they weren't, but I think when we talk about a certain kind of novelty, if that's what we mean by creativity, then they're obvious.
Okay, so you have a more functional kind of understanding of creativity, right? So what the output is. All right. So we don't have much time, but there is one thing I want to talk about actually, because it
Okay.
is kind of overlaps my area of research in
Yeah.
philosophy of mind, which is phenomenal knowledge. And you have a paper on this, the Frank Jackson's knowledge argument and the ability hypothesis response to the knowledge argument. So just very briefly, let me, for the listeners, just tell about this thought experiment, which is supposed to show us that physicalism is false, right? That mental states are not physical states. The idea is this is a thought experiment again. So there is this scientist, Mary, who lives in a black and white room all her life, but she's an expert, right? She's an expert about human color perception, conscious color perception. And she knows everything that is, every fact that is expressible in physical, logical, mathematical, scientific terms. She knows that. This is like in the future when we have completed science and everything. Okay, she knows everything from black and white, books and things like that about the brain, about the optics, everything. Yet one day she leaves the room and sees a red tomato, and then she says, so this is what it is like to see red. This is what people see when they see red. I didn't know this, but she knew every physical fact, according to Jackson, right? She knew every physical fact. Since she learned a new fact about what it is like to see red, that new fact that she learned cannot be a physical fact, because then she would have known it. Therefore, physicalism is false, and there are non-physical facts about human consciousness. Now, there is this ability hypothesis response to this thought experiment, which says, well, Mary didn't learn any new truth, any new fact, but just she acquired a new ability, cognitive ability. She learned how to imagine red, and also, according to Lewis, recognize it and remember it and things like that. But she didn't learn a new truth. It's something like this. She knew everything. Let's say she knew everything about swimming, right? So she was an expert on swimming in the room, but there was no pool or anything, not anything to swim in. So then she knows every physical fact about swimming. She leaves the room. She learns how to swim. And then can we say that, okay, she knew everything physical about swimming, but now she learned something about swimming, which is swimming itself. Therefore, swimming is not a physical activity, which just doesn't make sense. So this is the ability, right? So they say the same thing. Now, what do you think about this? Because you have a paper about this and you criticize the ability hypothesis approach.
Yeah. So when I'm taking this up in the context of this paper that you're talking about, I'm not so much trying to get clear on what we should ultimately think about the success of the thought experiment, right? Mm-hmm. But I guess I'm worried about what we're assuming about Mary and what's going on with Mary. So the thought is something like, oh, well, what seeing red is like is a kind of know-how. It's like riding a bike, right? And it consists in these certain abilities. And one of the ability is the ability to imagine. And so the thought is that Mary can't have this ability in the room. She doesn't know what red is like in the room. And it's only when she exits the room that she learns what seeing red is like. And so it's only then that she gains the ability to imagine red. And what I sort of question or push on, and I'm not 100% sure what I want to say about this, but what I push on is the question of whether Mary can or cannot imagine red while she's inside the room. And on the one hand, it seems like, I do feel the pull of the intuition. Wow, Mary has never seen anything in color. How on earth could she possibly imagine red inside the room? But here are a couple ways I try to diffuse that intuition a little bit. So first of all, we don't want to build in, well, there's a difference between imagining and imagining correctly, right? And so you might think that Mary can't imagine correctly red inside the room, but that's not to say that she can't imagine red. And so we have to tinker with the ability hypothesis to figure out exactly what it's saying. Like just imagining itself is different from imagining correctly. But then another thing that I kind of want to say about it relates to, certain feats of imagination seem really, really out of reach when we're not good at something. But people who are talented musicians can look at a score of music and know exactly what it's going to sound like. And the reason that they can do that is the compositionality, right, of the musical notes. And so they know what the note sounds like, and they can then put it all together. The problem with colors is that it doesn't seem like Mary has the elemental ingredients, right? And so that's why she can't build. But it might be that by the time we get to that future science where we know everything physical about color, we will have a better sense of the elemental aspects that can be communicated. And so Mary might be able to do something to put it together. I mean, maybe not, but that's sort of what I want to push on. Whether it's something that can be imagined, and if Mary is a very skilled imaginer, maybe she can do it. So just like if someone has a very skilled musical imagination, they can do things that we wouldn't expect.
So it's like the burden of proof is on Jackson, right? So to show us that she cannot imagine. Or it was on him, but he is a physicalist now, but back then. But I'm not very sure about this actually, because I'm not sure if Jackson really said that Mary couldn't imagine. Even if Mary could imagine, I don't think that would damage his argument, because he can say just this instead of just seeing the. By the way, so according to ability hypothesis, or the first original form of ability hypothesis, having the phenomenal knowledge is having the ability to imagine, right? But I think
it's imagine, remember, and recognize, right?
Yeah. So Nemero, first Nemero, when he talked about it, it was just imagination, right? And then Lewis said the others too. But I don't think having the ability to imagine is not sufficient, and there are some examples for this, because even if Mary had the ability to imagine, unless she exercises the ability, she wouldn't have, right? So it's not. But even if, let's say, Mary in the room was able to imagine red, right? Then can't Jackson just say this? Well, she had all the information, all the physical information, right? And then she imagined red, and then she learned something new. Therefore, what she learned from imagination is not a physical fact. So can't he just replace seeing red with imagining red and just make the same point?
Yeah, so I guess, I mean, to some extent, my target is more Lewis than Jackson. In the sense of, trying to show that there's a certain point at which we want to say Mary doesn't know what red. So go back to the example that you were just using, right? We want to say that Mary doesn't know what red is like, and she imagines it, and she comes to have the knowledge in virtue of her imagining. And so that suggests that we can't identify the knowing what it's like with the ability, because the ability preceded it. Yeah.
All right. I have more to talk about this, because my PhD dissertation was about this, but we are out of time, unfortunately. Thank you very much for this. I think this was really enjoyable and informative. So I hope, as I said, in the future we can, meet face to face and continue this talk about imagination. But I think it's a very important area, because it is also an intersection point of science and philosophy, right? There is a science about imagination, of course, neuroscience and psychology, and then there are philosophical aspects of it. And I think it's a very, very appropriate kind of area for interdisciplinary work, which I think is very important. So I think that's why this conversation was really important. So thank you very much for joining me, and
happy to be here.
Information.
Okay, great.
All right, then goodbye. And so it is morning there, I guess.
It is morning. It's still before noon. So yeah.
Then have a good day.
Okay. Thank you.